honored to be here on the panel with my colleague Nikita and Dr. Aisha Siddiqa, Zahid Hussain, and Charlotta. Especially since growing up, I watched the Afghan jihad against the Soviets on TV, and Sandy Gore was, your father, was one of the most ubiquitous faces then. I remember many of his reports, of course, on the ITV News, and we still have his book with all those lovely photographs, and where he talks about how difficult it is to take a leak in a shalwar kameez, and what a wonderful Indian word it is for raisins, you know, kishmish. And I remember snippets like that. So a real honor to be on the panel with you. And of course, partly inspired by that, I ended up joining that Afghan jihad right at the end, after the Soviets left and against the communist forces. And it's quite strange to watch watch a war on television growing up, and then take part in it as a 19-year-old when you've just become an adult. A bit like watching the Premier League on television, I suppose, and then one day the young kids who join the same team as their heroes, like David Beckham or somebody, or Wayne Rooney. It's a bit like that. I also have links with Pakistan. Of course, my parents are from India, originally from Delhi. They all moved to Pakistan at partition. We used to go to Pakistan every year for our summer holidays. I still speak Urdu to my parents. And I spent a year teaching in Pakistan in 2003, just after 9/11. At a military-run university. I was teaching artificial intelligence, etc. And I learned a lot from that, of course. 9/11 had just happened. The war in Afghanistan was going on next door. I was in Islamabad. And one of the things I remember was meeting somebody at a dinner party in Islamabad who clearly wasn't a liar, and he proclaimed to the dinner party the good news that bin Laden was still alive and well, and that the work was continuing. And at that time, most of us thought that bin Laden was either dead or in the tribal area on the border. So I was wondering how on earth this man in Islamabad was in touch with bin Laden. He was in touch. And of course, when bin Laden was killed in Abbottabad, where I'd driven a couple of times, it kind of made sense, that conversation way back. Right. Now, on to how committed is the West in sorting out terrorism? I've got 4 points on the theological stuff. But a quick point before that, a couple of quick points. One is about the use of the word radical. I entirely agree with the colleague at the back who said radical is a good thing. The co-founder and chairman of Quilliam is Majid Nawaz, and his autobiography is called simply Radical, because he's still a radical. He used to be a radical Islamist, as I used to be, you know, going off to Afghanistan. And our group from Britain sent dozens of fighters to Afghanistan, and later hundreds to Bosnia, and even a handful to Chechnya, and also dozens to Kashmir. And some of them were killed out in these places. So, you know, we regarded them as martyrs at the time. But we know what it's like. I've lost friends from Britain to the so-called jihads in Kashmir and Bosnia and other places. So radical, I regard myself as a radical. But hopefully we're on the right side now, campaigning for democracy and universal human rights and coexistence and a dialogue a dialogue between civilizations, coexistence and harmony between civilizations, and not a clash of civilization. Now, how committed is the West in rooting out these sources of terrorism? Well, one of those sources is actually Western policies themselves. I think we have to be clear about that. People have said that already, but that is one of the sources. So we should be clear about that. You know, enormous foreign policy mistakes. Another word which hasn't been mentioned is colonialism. Of course, a lot of the mess in the Muslim majority world and in the Eastern world is partly a result of colonialism. The fact that the UN Security Council is dominated by colonial powers who have the power of veto. These are all hangovers which we have to honestly confront. The United Nations need to be more democratic, for example. And so we have to be humble in the West. And I speak as a Western Muslim of Eastern origin, but I'm a proud Westerner as well as an Easterner, I suppose. We have to be a little bit more humble about our mistakes and our role in the world, but also, and I'm going to come on to, also assert our own values, our values which are also universal values, which is probably the crux of my argument. And by the way, on terrorism, I recommend a book by Professor Roger Griffin at Oxford, which is called The Terrorist Creed. And he looks at the history and the psychology and the emotional kind of motivation of terrorists throughout the ages, starting from the Zealots way back in ancient history. And it's one of the best treatments I've seen of that subject. So now, finally, on to Islam, reclaiming Islam from the extremists. Now, I speak as a believer, as a trained imam, somebody who's led prayers at mosques for 30 years in this country. I still work as an imam as well as a scientist. So, you know, it's very close to my heart. And the fact that people even have a serious conversation about whether Islamic State is Islamic or not is deeply painful to people like me and many other Muslims to see how our beautiful and noble religion and the teachings of the Holy Quran and the noble Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, have been so disfigured and distorted into groups that justify beheading children and crucifying people and enslaving women and raping and abusing them on a massive scale. It is incredibly disgusting and also very painful. So we have to do something about it. And civil society is needed in Pakistan, in the UK, in other places, to reclaim this ground from the extremists who often dominate the discourse and shout the loudest. Now, you know, I was a committed Islamist for 20 years. As I said, fought the jihad, was willing to die, saw my friends go off and die, some of them. So I know all these narratives or these ideas very well. They're very close to my heart. And I argue with these 4 points, and other colleagues have come up with the same 4 points independently. So that gives me some encouragement that perhaps we're on the right lines. And those are, I think, the Islamists, whether it's the non-violent ones, but all the way through to the violent ones, like IS and Al-Qaeda and Taliban, but also the non-violent ones, like the Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat-e-Islami, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and others, share 4 major notions which they're very committed to, which are mentioned in the Quran, but which I would argue that they have totally misunderstood and twisted and politicized. You know, partly as a result to colonialism and the events of the 20th century, but that doesn't justify it. Now, the first one is Ummah, the idea of the Muslim nation, that all Muslims are one nation, brothers and sisters, and therefore we have to support our brothers and sisters everywhere. Now, that can be a very genuine and noble notion, which means people go off to risk their lives and help others elsewhere. As Carlotta said, you know, Arabs going to support Afghans and Bosnians and laying down their lives, actually dying in their thousands to support people they've never met simply because they shared the same faith. And we were ready to do that. However, the downside of it is it can be very tribalistic. And this is a problem with all major religions, that once you have believers and non-believers, you have your group and the out-group, it can very quickly become tribalistic and become us versus them. And this is a major problem right now in Muslim discourse worldwide, but not only in Muslim discourse, in all major world religions. Because I agree with, I think with Aisha, or somebody who said that the problem of extremism and violent extremism affects all religions. You have terrorists and extremists in every single religion. And at the moment, Islam has a major problem with it, but other religions have it as well. Even Buddhism, with the 969 movement in Myanmar. You have Christian violent fundamentalists. You have Jewish extremist terrorists in Israel, the violent settlers. You've had Hindu groups. We've had Sikh groups. I remember the Khalistan movement in Bhindranwala and all that with the Golden Temple in the 80s. So these are common human, emotional, and psychological aspects of religion and politics which can appear. Now, if you read the Quran deeply and read the classical tradition of Islam and the theology, there was a much deeper meaning of Ummah, which was one nation of humanity. Humanity is one nation. Like all the religions teach that God created us from one source, Adam and Eve, or whatever the story is. But we have one source, as the gentleman said at the front. You know, we are all created by God. We have that common source. So that's very important to reclaim the idea of nationhood. It's not just simply about Muslims versus the rest, us versus them, which you hear from IS and from Al-Qaeda and all the other groups over and over again. Muslims are suffering. Well, other people are suffering as well. You know, humanity has suffering. It also has good and evil everywhere. The second one is the idea of a caliphate, which of course IS established. And the idea is they want a single super state uniting all the Muslim peoples around the world, but they don't want to stop there, don't forget. They want to expand it and actually conquer the whole world. That is their fantasy. It's not limited to the Muslim world. They want to conquer the whole of Europe and the Americas and Africa, Australasia, the whole world. That's their ideal. One caliph ruling the lot. And for many of these groups, this is a divine obligation. They believe God has commanded them to implement this political model worldwide, and they have no other option. And that's why they're committed to this fanatical zealotry to achieve their aim. But again, if you look at, this is not a classical position. The classical theologians were very aware that the caliphate developed in particular political circumstances, and it was a political model that made sense at the time or worked. And as long as it worked, it was fine. And what you needed was the rule of law, civilization, good governance. That was the root of the caliphate, good governance in consultation with the people, because the chapter of the Quran is simply called consultation. And in Islamic history, you had times we had 3 different caliphs around the world. And the scholars, the theologians at that time said there's no problem as long as they're not fighting each other. As long as there's peace and you didn't have instant communication, etc., or instant travel or fast travel, there's no problem having different caliphates. And that's why most Muslim theologians, overwhelmingly, in the 20th century, had no problem with the nation state. Now, the Islamist groups have a big problem with the nation state. They do not recognize it at all. So ISIS says that, every nation state is invalid. You can't be a citizen of any country. Muslims must only give allegiance to IS. Boko Haram, who are now part of IS in Nigeria, do not accept the Nigerian state. They say this is a artificial British creation and we cannot be part of a nation with the Christians. And so there's a big divide in Nigeria from their point of view between the Christian and the Muslims. And others, of course, said that in India with the Hindus and Sikhs and Buddhists and everybody else. So it's very important to deconstruct this whole notion of the caliphate. A colleague of mine, Ghaffar Hussain, summarized in a brief article called The Caliphate Delusion, if you want to look at that. And he quoted the great Ibn Khaldun in his Muqaddimah, who kind of summarized it perfectly, that the caliphate is about basically good governance. The third one is Sharia, the sacred law of Islam. And of course, all these groups believe in implementing the Sharia, and they invoke the Sharia. Now, and the problem is they have a medieval interpretation, or perhaps they even twist the medieval interpretation. And this is why they've brought back slavery, crucifixions, beheadings, amputations, floggings, and all the rest of it, because they haven't evolved in their thinking. There are modern interpretations of Sharia which are compatible, entirely support and endorse universal human rights, for example, and gender equality, and the civilization of nations rather than conflict. So it depends, which Sharia we are talking about. And the final one is jihad. And again, the classical tradition of jihad is about war. It's about ethical war. It's a sacred war, a holy war. It's very similar to the Christian idea of a just war from St. Augustine. If you read Averroes, Ibn Rushd had a very short Kitab al-Jihad, which he wrote in Spain, in Europe, 800-900 years ago. And he talks about the ethical principles of warfare and why people go to war and who they can target, who they can't. And it is an ethical tradition, which is why I don't apologize for jihad or any of these notions. They are actually very deep and universal notions when correctly understood, as actually the vast majority of the Muslim tradition has in the past and at the moment. But it tends to be the fundamentalists who take the most divisive interpretation of these notions and cause so much chaos. And I'll just give you one example of that. Oh, next slide, please, Nikita. Oh, by the way, sorry, just go back. If you're interested, I'll summarize those 4 arguments in a piece I wrote for the BBC days after the beheading of drummer Rigby on the streets of London, which brought it home. Yeah, so final slide. This is some of the work I've done at Quilliam in terms of the religious reform series. So 3 publications so far, and lots of other op-eds and, of course, media interviews, and we go out to schools and community groups and universities. One is called The Balance of Islam in Challenging Extremism. The second one is called No Compulsion in Religion, Islam and Freedom of Belief. So that's explicitly about freedom of expression and religion. And the third one is the latest one. It's a 100-page essay. If you're interested, do have a look. It's called From Dhimmitude to Democracy. There's the front cover with a picture from Jerusalem of a church and mosque in coexistence. Do have a look at that. It has 40 pages from the classical tradition translated into English for the first time from the commentaries on the Quran and the jurisprudence texts. But I'll just give you one example of a paragraph from there about universal human rights. Actually, I'll give you a few. Actually, I've got a minute or two.
We're getting very close to time. Could you?
Yeah. Okay.
So we can have at least a few questions.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll quickly quote from the. This is on page 4 of that report, which you'll find on our website. All of these. The Ottoman Sultan in the 1830s gave a sermon where he said Ottomans are all equal citizens. Whether they're Jew, Muslim, or Christian, the only difference is on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, whether they're in a synagogue, mosque, or church. The rest of the time, they are equal citizens. Muhammad Ali Jawhar talked about Hindu-Muslim unity, the United Faith of India. Jinnah gave the famous speech soon after Pakistan was formed to say you're free to go to your mosques, temples, churches, wherever. You're free to have your religion, but you're all equal as citizens of Pakistan. And just finally, on the universal human rights, I'll just finish with this. A few lines. This is from Professor Recep Sentok of the US. He mentioned that the Ottoman Declaration of Regulations, the Tanzimat Farmani in 1839, may be seen as the first Islamic human rights declaration in the modern sense. And when the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights was announced in 1948, Turkish scholars of Islamic law such as Kazim Kadri and Ali Fuad Basgil produced works advocating that it was consistent with Islamic law and thus deserved the support of Muslims. The work of ancient prophets and philosophers can therefore be seen as achievements towards the universal concept of the human. And I'll stop there. It's about universal humanity, universal human rights, shared humanity, and shared values are some of the keys to winning this reclamation fight. Thank you very much.
My question is to you, and I'll be very brief. 3. What inspired you to join the jihad? Number 2, I constantly heard the name they and us in the entire discourse. So why is it that Quran and the interpretation of they and us has been so different for various groups and people? Why is it given to such different interpretations? What makes it to be given to such a radical, or let me not call it radical, but such different divisive interpretations? And the third one, they and us, is it not time that the Muslim world would include the they and take the responsibility of the they who have been divisive, or let's say radical in apostrophe, and address the problem within rather than call them they constantly? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I think, I mean, there's no need, I could be wrong, but for reconciliation. That's the beauty, I think, of debate and policy, that, you know, there are many different things that can be recommended. I did really like your point about families, though, because you're right. In South Asia, a lot of discussion, and, I mean, you have more extended families, you have a much tighter family grouping than you would say in the West. So that is definitely a space which can be used adequately to discuss issues such as violence and normalization of violence within private spheres. Now, to leave those private spheres and say that it's a model that would not fit, so let's just leave it as it is, I think would be making a grave mistake. How much the role the West has to play in this, I think, I mean, it's a model that could be implemented within from South Asian actors, not necessarily the West going in and doing that. So, yeah.
Okay, yes, so thank you for the question. Why did I join? Because I believed in the utopian Islamist ideal that we were helping to create a perfect Islamic state which would rule the whole world eventually and would bring peace and happiness everywhere. And I was also defending my Afghan brothers and sisters, you know, who felt a strong bond with. The idea was that you were with all people like that. So that's why I joined up. It's very similar to many of the reasons why people join up to groups like IS or AQ all around the world. Secondly, why are the different interpretations of the Quran, etc.? This is not a problem, again, only for Islam. All scripture is liable to exclusivist interpretations. Every religion has it. You have exclusivist interpretations where it's us versus them, and you exclude the other. So only we're saved, everybody else is going to hell, or they're damned, you know, damnation for the rest, salvation for us. But all religious scriptures also have an inclusivist interpretation, where you know, we're all created by God, or God's children, or whatever the phrasing is, and that, in my view, is the only way forward. President Obama said that recently. He said in a speech a couple of years ago that basically we need inclusivist interpretations, because the exclusivist ones do create division and conflict. And I'm not sure if I understood the last part of your question in terms of them and us. If you were talking about them as non-believers, then I think I've already covered that with the inclusivist aspect. Oh, you mean the extremists themselves?
No, yes. But is
Yeah.
it not time for the Muslim world to take responsibility of their own sect of Muslims? And
Yeah.
instead of saying they're not good Muslims or they are
Yeah, I agree. I agree entirely with that. We need inclusive language even with the extremists and terrorists. You have to talk to terrorists as well. And governments all around the world do that, but you have to build the structures and find the common base to do that. And in the first short publication there, I give examples from early Islamic history. You know, in the early Islamic history, Ali Imam or Caliph Ali had a problem with violent extremist rebels. It's not a new problem for Islam. And he tried to be as inclusive as possible. He engaged in dialogue with them, and he was inclusive with them. He refused to excommunicate them, even though they excommunicated him. And he also used military action when he had to. But we have to try to engage with people and be as inclusive as possible as humans. But sometimes, when people are determined to fight, the only way is to fight back, fortunately.
I just have a quick question for Dr. Hassan. This whole concept of jihad, it's also one part of it is also based on the whole debate of legitimacy of a Muslim state. I mean, that's where it essentially started as well. So what do you think? I mean, when groups acquire the right to wage jihad, which actually should be done by the state, but they say the state will do it because the state is not legitimate, it's illegitimate. I mean, how then and here are these problems in almost every single Muslim state. So how do you engage with that problem? Can you make it very brief, because we really have run out of time?
Well, very quickly, I think you've hit on a crucial issue there, and that's tied up with caliphate versus nation state and jihad. You're absolutely right. Classically, only a state or authority could declare jihad. Now you have non-state groups declaring jihad, and that's complete nonsense. And that's why I talk about the ethics of warfare. Muslims and Muslim states have and should sign up to universal treaties, international treaties, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Convention on Warfare, and everything else. And the fundamentalists don't accept that because they reject the modern world and they reject international agreements and want to do things for themselves.